What if I told you that the legacy of Freddie Mercury, the man who redefined what it meant to be a rock star, just got turned upside down again? For decades, we've marveled at the soaring voice, the larger-than-life persona, the outrageous stage antics that made stadiums quake and kept audiences on the edge of their seats. But imagine, just for a moment, that there are still secrets lurking in the shadows of his story. The kind of secrets that could have you questioning everything you thought you knew about the most magnetic frontman in history. Brace yourself, because recent revelations and jaw-dropping events have exposed strange new layers in the saga of Freddie Mercury, some so astonishing even the most devoted Queen aficionados have been left reeling. Let's dive into the heart of what's rocked the Queen fandom to its core. In 2025, a bombshell biography dropped, Love, Freddie by Lesley-Ann Jones. This isn't your typical tribute. Within its pages lies a charge so wild, so disrupting, it's made international headlines and sparked endless debate online. The claim? That in 1976, while the world was captivated by the operatic genius of Bohemian Rhapsody and the explosive rise of Queen, Freddie Mercury may have quietly fathered a daughter. Imagine the headlines: Freddie Mercury, secret father. The speculation is seismic. For more than 3 decades, Mercury's private world has been fiercely protected, guarded by confidants, and shrouded in mystery. Now, this possibility blurs the line between myth and reality all over again. The response has been thunderous. Fans have scrambled for answers, poring over every lyric, every photograph, every rare scrap of interview footage for clues. Was there a moment, a fleeting glance, a coded phrase, pointing to a hidden child? Critics and biographers debate authenticity. Is this a stunning revelation, or the product of wishful thinking, and the ceaseless hunger for new Scorpio twists in Freddie's legend? Either way, the specter of a secret daughter forces us to reconsider the stories we've told and retold about Queen's charismatic frontman. What would it mean for the Mercury estate, for the millions who find inspiration in his legacy, if the bloodline suddenly extended beyond what we've always believed? But the world isn't just interested in Mercury's hidden legacies. In September 2023, an event occurred so monumental, it sent ripples through both the music world and the art world alike. A Sothebys auction that put nearly 1,500 of Mercury's treasured possessions up for sale. The scale of the auction was breathtaking. Fans and collectors alike lined up, both virtually and in person, for a chance to own the tiniest piece of Freddie's extraordinary life. Do you realize what was on that auction block? His Yamaha Baby Grand Piano, the very instrument immortalized as the birthplace of so many iconic Queen melodies. Imagine it. The first chords of Bohemian Rhapsody, hammered out not in a spiritless studio, but on this very piano in the privacy of Mercury's Kensington home. The emotional weight is enormous, and it's no wonder that this one instrument alone fetched a sum that broke auction records. But that wasn't all. Among the thousands of lots were handwritten lyrics, painstakingly scrawled and edited, veins of ink capturing Mercury's restless creativity in real time. Original costumes shimmered from behind glass, some of them even retaining a faint trace of his perfume or the wear and tear of a relentless world tour. Jewelry, art, even the contents of his celebrated bedroom, each item bounding from the personal to the mythic, blurring the line between the man and the legend. The demand was stratospheric. Bidders from every continent placed their hopes behind a paddle, knowing they weren't just buying artifacts. They were snatching at a slice of history, trying to get as close as possible to the core meteor that was Freddie Mercury. The record-breaking sales sent shockwaves, not only for their monetary value but for what they represented. A final dispersal of Mercury's most personal effects. For some, it felt like the closing of a vault, the ultimate transition from flesh and blood artist to immortal icon, whose essence is now scattered among the world's collectors and museums. Yet each object tells a fragment of the story. Each scrap of paper, each thread, each note played, whispers something new about a man the world never truly managed to pin down. What does it mean now that these intimate possessions are in the hands of strangers? For some fans, there's a quiet sadness, a sense that the last links to the private Freddie Mercury are vanishing. For others, it's a rare, tantalizing chance to own a sliver of the stardust he left behind. But before Freddie Mercury became the referent for rock royalty, his journey began in places many fans scarcely imagine, the balmy islands of Zanzibar and the bustling streets of India. His story doesn't start on a London stage beneath blinding lights, but in a vibrant, multicultural setting, born Farrokh Bulsara in 1946 to Parsi Indian parents. Early childhood for Freddie was a swirl of Zoroastrian tradition, colonial legacy, and the everyday magic of his father's memorabilia shop on the island. It's almost cinematic, the contrast between his family's quiet discipline and the son who would grow up to wage war against conformity with every sequin, with every chord, with every toss of his famously dramatic mic stand. By age 8, his parents saw something flickering, a restlessness, an intensity that wouldn't be contained by Zanzibar's shores. They sent him to St. Peter's School, a British-run boarding school in Panchgani, India, where, for the first time, he tasted the complicated beauty of separation and the creative potential that comes with being an outsider. Here, young Farrokh became Freddie. Here, too, he formed his first band, the Hectics, tantalizing classmates and teachers alike with what would become his trademark onstage bravado. The shy boy who missed home was already learning to turn loneliness and longing into spectacle and song, already aware of how music could be both armor and invitation. But the world was changing fast, and it would not allow Freddie the luxury of a gentle adolescence. The Zanzibar Revolution of 1964 erupted in violence and chaos, sending the Bulsara family fleeing to England with little more than hope, heartbreak, and the commune of their traditions. Suddenly, Freddie was an immigrant teenager in the tumult of a new country, caught between identities, ambitions, and the gray drizzle of a foreign sky. For most, this would be the backdrop of a tale about struggle and assimilation. But for Freddie, it became the crucible. The displacement, the outsider's perspective, would become the rocket fuel for everything he was about to create. What came next is the stuff of rock legend. A man determined not just to fit in, but to stand out so spectacularly that no one could ever look away. You think you know Freddie Mercury? Maybe you do. But as these dramatic revelations and the echoes of his childhood remind us, there's always another door to open, another side to see. And it's behind those doors and in those shadows that the most extraordinary stories begin. The story of Freddie Mercury only accelerates from here, and as we leave behind the swirling colors of his youth, we land breathless in the heart of Britain's explosive music scene. London, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was a wild swirl of subcultures. Punk was sharpening its claws, glam rock was a living fever dream, and every smoky club throbbed with the possibility of something absolutely extraordinary just waiting to be unleashed. For Freddie, who'd already learned to live in contradictions and navigate the liminal spaces between identities, this new world was less overwhelming than it was electrifying. He wasn't interested in clawing his way to the middle. He wanted everything, and he wanted it on his own terms. Legend has it Freddie crashed into the lives of Brian May and Roger Taylor, then still part of a band called Smile, with such velocity and charisma that even their skepticism melted into astonishment. And here's where the wheels of fate really started to spin. Freddie wasn't content to just sing. He wanted to shape the entire vision, designing the now iconic Queen crest by weaving together the zodiac signs of each band member, as if to say, yes, we're not just a group, we're a constellation. There's a wild joy in the way Queen named themselves, a direct, in-your-face challenge to the norms of British masculinity of the era. Some called it arrogant, others provocative. But for Freddie, boldness was the only option. He was going to take everything they said couldn't be done and make it deliriously, defiantly real. Yet none of this happened overnight. Queen's earliest days were paved with frustration, rejection, and the grinding reality of making it in an industry that didn't know what to do with them. Record executive after record executive scratched their heads at the band's refusal to play by the rules. Opera, hard rock, vaudeville, cabaret, it was all colliding within Queen's sound, and nobody was sure that kind of creative chaos would ever sell. But Freddie was relentless, almost fanatical in his conviction that every risk he took would eventually blow the roof right off the place. He wanted albums that sounded as grand as a full-blown opera. He wanted concerts that felt halfway between a rock show and a pagan ritual. So when Queen finally broke through with the spectacle that was Bohemian Rhapsody, it was as if the universe itself had been waiting for somebody to dare that hard, to dream that big. Can you imagine the uproar? Here was a rock song, 6 minutes of operatic drama, wild tempo changes, and not a single safe radio-ready chorus in sight. And the moment it landed, people couldn't look away. Overnight, Queen, led by Freddie's madcap genius, became more than a band. They were an event. Every performance, every music video, every interview became fodder for legend. And at the center of it all was Freddie Mercury throwing himself into the world with such feverish passion that it bordered on reckless. There were rumors, of course there were, about his sexuality, his unpredictable moods, and the endlessly inventive parties that blurred the boundary between escapism and decadence. But this isn't just tabloid fodder. It's the high-wire act that every true revolutionary artist must walk. What the world saw as scandal, Freddie often used as inspiration, cranking up his boundary-pushing persona until it was impossible not to watch. Yet even as Queen soared to planet-straddling heights, there were troubles brewing behind the scenes. Freddie's vision couldn't always coexist smoothly with those of his bandmates, especially as he started to chase new sounds that sent the band veering off in wild directions. The hot space era comes to mind here, when disco and funk influences colored their work and caused friction both within Queen and among their devoted followers. Critics derided the new sound, haters sneered at the departure from classic rock bombast. But to Freddie, being predictable was far worse than making a few enemies. He was chasing the raw thrill of invention, and if it meant risking everything, so be it. It's in the crucible of these tensions that those secret, dedicated relationships were forged, the band as a dysfunctional but unbreakable family. And it's no wonder, with Freddie's personality so electric and formidable, that Queen's creative process was as tempestuous as it was magical. The stories about late-night recording sessions verge on the mythic. Pianos thundering, voices rising in four-part harmony, arguments erupting, and then, like lightning, moments of transcendent unity that spilled into tracks now burned into the annals of rock history. The world, of course, only ever saw the outcome, the strut, the fire, the uncontainable showmanship. But inside those studios, beneath the surface, it was pure alchemy. And while that creative friction played out professionally, Freddie's personal life was no less labyrinthine. The tabloids couldn't get enough of trying to label him. Was he this? Was he that? What secrets was he hiding behind those outrageous costumes? But for those closest to him, the reality was always far more intimate. Freddie himself admitted, sometimes in moments of candor that still catch even the most jaded biographer by surprise, that he simply poured everything he couldn't say directly into the music. If you wanted the truth, the real, unvarnished Freddie, you had to listen with your whole self. You had to look past the makeup, the theatrics, and tune into the heartbreak and longing threaded through every note he sang. You had to see how he clung to Mary Austin, his once lover, then lifelong confidant, in the midst of all that chaos, or how fiercely he guarded his privacy, even as global fame threatened to strip it all away. Now, as secret children and lost pianos are thrust into the spotlight, you can't help but feel the full measure of what Freddie Mercury spent his whole life both fleeing and chasing. The tension between exposure and concealment, the push and pull between myth and reality. Whenever the world thinks it has a final answer about who Freddie Mercury really was, something new erupts, another revelation, another artifact, another rumor that refuses to die. Maybe that's why, even now, his story continues to morph, to grow stranger and more confounding as time moves on. We're only just getting started. So if you're ready to keep unraveling the threads of rock's wildest tapestry, smash that subscribe button and let us know your wildest Freddie Mercury theory in the comments below. Because in the world of Queen, nothing is ever quite what it seems in the show. Well, it must always go on. Everything after the stratospheric breakthrough of Bohemian Rhapsody put Queen and Freddie Mercury into a kind of rarefied orbit where ordinary rules stopped applying. The music press in Britain could barely keep up, breathless at the spectacle every time Queen dared step on a stage. And front and center always was Freddie, in impossibly tight sequined jumpsuits or cloaked in regal capes, or striding toward the crowd and demanding their surrender with a single flick of his wrist. If you think about Live Aid in '85, the world got to see it in purest form. Freddie didn't just command attention, he devoured it. Wembley Stadium wasn't a venue, it was his playground. And 2 billion people around the globe watched this man turn a fundraising gig into the defining moment of pop music history. You'd have to be made of stone not to feel it. His voice hitting those notes, his strutting and posing a kind of joyous provocation. It felt less like a setlist and more like a declaration. Music can be anything we make it. But draped around that dazzling spectacle, shadows lengthened. Maybe it's inevitable. The higher you soar, the darker the clouds when they gather. For Freddie Mercury, the toll of stardom began to express itself in sharper, more private ways. Gossip columns drooled over his nightlife. Stories multiplied about wild parties that sometimes seemed to spin out of anyone's control, filled with the kinds of excess that seemed to come as standard with rock stardom in the 70s and 80s. Was he provoking the world, or was he trying to lose himself? Was it all just performance? Or was there something desperate at play? A need to outrun the loneliness that comes with living at such extremes of fame? Close friends would later reflect that behind every caustic joke and champagne-fueled entrance, you could sometimes catch a glimpse of someone who wanted, desperately, to be understood, or maybe just left alone. It's a paradox that pulses through everything Freddie ever created. On tape, his voice could level a cathedral. In person, he could seem almost unreachable, shuttered off from those he didn't trust. Journalists hungry for confessions about his real identity would probe and prod, but Freddie always danced away, sometimes with humor, sometimes with acid wit, and sometimes just by refusing to answer at all. Even his sexuality, which now seems such a fundamental part of his iconography, was for years only a murmured rumor in the mainstream, fiercely guarded by his insistence that his private life was his own business. In an era when outing someone without their consent was considered both sport and scandal, Freddie turned ambiguity into armor. You could call him mysterious, or you could just say he understood, better than anyone, the necessity of keeping certain treasures hidden. But for all the stories about after-party madness and rock and roll decadence, the most lasting relationships in Freddie Mercury's world were astonishingly steady. Mary Austin remained central, her devotion woven straight through every era of his life, integral to every decision and heartbreak. And later, Jim Hutton became another pillar of quiet resilience, a partner whose presence offered privacy and solace far from the carnivalesque energy of Freddie's public persona. It's tempting to imagine those quieter moments, tucked behind heavy doors in Kensington. Freddie away from the stage, feeding his beloved cats, sketching song ideas on napkins, simply stealing a precious breath. Professionally, though, Freddie never truly rested. With each new album, he sharpened his edge, chased the next revelation, craved the next reinvention. Queen's catalog exploded in genre and audacity, fueled by Freddie's daring hunger for transformation. From gospel inflections on Somebody to Love to the disco pulse of Another One Bites the Dust, they refused, flat out refused, to settle into the space their critics carved for them. Where the rock establishment demanded a repeat of old formulas, Freddie insisted on risk, even when it meant alienating fans or sparking sometimes bruising debates within the band itself. The Hot Space saga is testament to that. While some fans found this pivot baffling or even infuriating, Freddie shrugged off every complaint like an inconvenient rumor. To stay in motion was to stay alive. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to pin him down. Still, there's something distinctly human, almost fragile beneath that bravado. In those years, whispers swelled around new creative partnerships, like the infamous attempted collaboration with Michael Jackson. Imagine the sheer magnitude of ego and vision in that room. On paper, the pairing promised genius. In reality, their differences, both personal and professional, kept derailing their sessions. There are tales of conflicts over drugs, of Jackson's preference for a hyper-controlled environment, clashing violently with the chaos that so often inspired Freddie. But let's be honest, maybe it was doomed from the start. Two icons, both obsessive, both fiercely protective of their creative processes. Some collaborations are simply too combustible to survive. Yet even as his outer world spun wilder and his inner circle tightened, artistic stakes only escalated. At every crossroads, Queen responded not by retreating, but by doubling down. More shows, higher stakes, wilder visuals, and lyrics that swung between operatic grandeur and intimate confession. You can hear it in Under Pressures, that frenetic duet with David Bowie. That risk didn't just propel them to the top of the charts. It gave voice to both the soaring euphoria and the relentless anxiety that pulsed through the veins of anyone trying to create, to love, to simply exist under the white-hot floodlights of global scrutiny. But by the mid to late 1980s, even the most stubbornly private superstar couldn't outrun a different kind of pressure. Tabloid speculation hit fever pitch as Freddie's appearance began to shift. Paparazzi stalked, lenses lurking just past fences, searching for evidence of weakness. Rumors of illness, always cloaked in innuendo, never directly addressed, shadowed every public appearance. In public, Freddie stood defiant, still uncannily magnetic. In private, he was fighting a battle that few could imagine, much less comprehend. It was in these moments, not on stage but away from it, that the magnitude of Freddie's courage became most visible. Not just as a singer, but as a human being facing down the fear of being reduced to a headline or a tabloid cautionary tale. And yet, even as his body weakened, Freddie refused surrender. In those later studio sessions, his voice sometimes strained and trembling, he somehow summoned performances that radiated as much power and tenderness as any in his catalog. You listen to the last songs and you hear a man who understands what's ending, but is determined to burn incandescent until he absolutely can't anymore. There's a grit there, a fierce refusal to be defined by anything, not illness, not publicity, not even time itself. This is where we begin to see just how deep the layers of Freddie Mercury go. It wasn't only about music or image, fame or love, but about the indomitable will to keep creating, even as the world closes in, even as the legend threatens to eclipse the man. Keep watching, because beyond the spotlights, behind every rumor and revelation, Freddie's true legacy is just beginning to reveal itself. In the closing chapter of Freddie Mercury's public life, the collision of myth and reality reached its most poignant intensity. The world, obsessed with knowing every detail, began to sense the edges of a secret that could not stay hidden forever. Headlines speculated. Whispers grew louder. Yet, through it all, Freddie played one final brilliant trick on his audience. He kept singing. It would have been so easy to retreat completely, to slip behind the gates of Garden Lodge and never emerge. But that was never Freddie's style. He may have loathed interviews and dodged questions about his health with biting humor, but in the one language that truly mattered, his music, he told us everything. Listen closely to the records from those final years. There's a stubborn joy, a melancholy clarity, a grandeur undimmed by frailty. It's as if he knew that every phrase, every crescendo might be a last chance to be heard, and he wrung every ounce of beauty from it. When you hear him belt out, "The show must go on," knowing that he was almost too ill to stand, you realize that performance wasn't just a mask. It was a shield. It was survival. It was truth, sung at the top of his lungs. Beyond the music, Freddie's last days shimmer with contradictions. There are stories about evenings surrounded by friends, laughter echoing through the house, a glass of wine raised in mock toast at some private joke. And there are stories just as vivid of quiet afternoons spent with Mary Austin or Jim Hutton, the chatter fading to companionable silence as the sun slipped behind the London rooftops. The extravagance and loneliness, the wildness and restraint, it all existed side by side in those shaded rooms. Did he understand, as the end approached, just how much of himself he had given away and how much he had fought to keep? If you look at those closest to him, you sense that the real mourning began long before the world caught up. Mary, keeper of his secrets, executor of his last wishes, endured the vigil with a kind of fortitude that feels almost mythic in its own way. Jim Hutton, steadfast through the turmoil, remained Freddie's chosen companion until the very last. These weren't just loyal friends. They were the silent architects of his peace, the witnesses to the shrinking of his dazzling world into something much more intimate, and at times achingly small. It's easy to imagine that in those final exchanges, the weight of the outside world fell away. If the spotlight defined him in life, the withdrawal from it became his final act of self-possession. And yet, just as the world braced itself for the loss, something astonishing happened. Freddie dictated one last message to the public. No manufactured melodrama, no plea for sympathy, just that crisp, matter-of-fact admission. Yes, I have AIDS. Yes, it's true. The veil dropped, and in that instant, 1,000 unspoken stories came rushing into the light. Suddenly, the superstar whose very existence had been a lesson in sidestepping shame became the face of a threat millions were too scared to name. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a farewell. It was a challenge. A final, defiant dare to the world. Look at me now. See all of me. Mercury, forever the master of spectacle, turned his greatest vulnerability into an emblem of resistance. The silence, finally broken, didn't just humanize him. It galvanized people. It changed the conversation. It left the world reeling, devastated, scrambling to catch up to the courage he had shown all along. After his death, there was shock and there was grief, but there was also, unmistakably, a sense of having witnessed something rare. The kind of authenticity that leaves its mark not on a single generation, but on the fabric of what it means to be seen, to be heard, to be utterly oneself in a world that punishes difference. In the months and years that followed, Freddie's house became a site of pilgrimage. The songs played on radios, at stadiums, at protests and parties, and in the private hours when only music can make sense of things. Tributes rushed in, not just from fans, but from people who suddenly realized what had been lost. An artist who had, through sheer force of will, bent the rules of rock music right over his knee and stared defiantly into the camera while doing it. But here's the truth. The finality of death did not diminish the power of Freddie Mercury's story. If anything, it just pushed it forward, demanding that we look unflinchingly at the complexity behind the persona. He wasn't some untouchable legend, immune to pain or contradiction. He was, instead, the example of what happens when a person refuses to be reduced, refuses to play it safe, refuses to apologize for loving what he loved and living as hard as he could. Over time, the rumors and scandals have faded, replaced by a far more interesting legacy. Generations of artists who cite him as their guiding light. People who hold him up as the reason they dared to be themselves. Teenagers from Moscow to Rio to Johannesburg, strapping on air guitars and wailing along in bedrooms, feeling, if only for a moment, like kings and queens of their own little empires. And isn't that the real magic of Freddie Mercury's life? The sense that even at his most outrageous, he was inviting us all to share the stage, to claim a little bit of that defiance and freedom for ourselves. The legend lives on in film scores and remixes, in catwalks and street murals, in every chant of "We Will Rock You," rattling the rafters of some middle school gymnasium. Most of all, though, it endures in the daring act of creating, not just music, but meaning, community, identity, when everyone tells you not to. So as that curtain falls on this part of the journey, ask yourself, what are you hiding behind? What is it that only you can create if you stopped apologizing for who you are? If you've ever felt like you couldn't say what you meant or wear what you love or love who you loved, let this story be a spark. Because Freddie Mercury didn't just give us songs, he gave us permission. Permission to be messy, to be brilliant, to be complicated, to be, in every way, fearlessly alive. If you want to keep diving into the hidden narratives and untold stories of music's greatest legends, don't just sit back. Hit that subscribe button now. Leave a comment below about what Freddie means to you, or the moment Queen's music hit you like a thunderbolt. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that the show must go on, no matter how impossible it seems. We've got so much more to explore, and you are a crucial part of this story. Turn up the volume, keep the magic alive, and remember, the spotlight is big enough for us all.